An empire is very much like a person. A person has a body and a soul, and the body of an empire is its landmass, but the soul of an empire are the ideas, the concepts, the philosophy, or the ideology which regulates the relationships between the humans, between the people who live within the landmass, and that produces a distinct, unique civilization different to other empires. In the wake of military defeats and lost land and encounters with other civilizations, the Ottomans would look to change some ideas within their military, within their administration, but also some ideas which regulate the relationships between their citizens, between their people. This time period of Ottoman history is known as the Tanzimat, pronounced in English as Tanzimat, and it means the reorganization. The only question is, would these new ideas, i.e. this new soul, would it be acceptable to the people who live within the landmass, or would it be rejected by the people who live within the landmass of the Ottoman Empire? This is the Gulhani Park. It used to be the private gardens of the Caliph. You might be able to just see the Topkapi Palace walls behind me, but now it's a public park. But here, in 1839, while it was still part of the palace, an important edict was announced by the new Caliph, Abdul Majid. And the reason why he had to make this announcement were several. Number one, the Muslim population were very disgruntled because the previous Caliph, Mahmud II, had undergone aggressive centralization of a historically decentralized empire. So the relationship between the ruler and the ruled had changed dramatically. Also, the non-Muslim population in the Balkans were trying, or some of them were trying to ally with other empires, or they wanted to be independent, or they are well on their way to adopting nationalism because of their encounters with other empires. The Ottomans were also behind militarily, technologically, and educationally. All this needed to be addressed, and these were the reasons why Abdul Majid issued the Gulhani Edict here in the Gulhani Park in 1839. With the Janissaries gone, the Caliph and the ulama lacked the physical ability to put their policy into place, because the Janissaries were more than just a military force. They were also an economic force and a civil force. So now they started to emerge a fatwa culture and an edict culture, whereby the people in power would interact with the ruled through official writings, and the Gulhani Edict is a very good example of this. In fact, it's the first example of this. And this style of interacting with the public through official writings is a reason why some historians say that the Gulhani Edict is actually a semi-constitutional document. And this type of interaction with the public is actually what pushed the Ottomans to go down the route of constitutionalism in just a few decades' time. You'll find out more about that in the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Muslims and non-Muslims alike were given the right to life, property, religion, and equal status. And many Muslims liked this because it meant that the Khalifa the Caliph could no longer confiscate their properties under the guise of centralization and stability. Many non-Muslims like this because it gave them equal status, which meant they no longer had to pay the jizya tax. However, there were many non-Muslims who did not like this, especially the religious clergy, because they now lost their positions as head of their denomination and gave them a seat of political power in the court of the Caliph, because now the non-Muslim citizens were equal with the Muslims, so they reported directly to the Caliph just like the Muslims. There were also some Muslim scholars who didn't like this either, because it was seen as a departure from Islamic norms and traditions. However, in reality, the jizya tax was actually still collected. It just wasn't called jizya, it was just called a military exemption tax. Some people think that the Tanzimat reforms and the Gulhani Edict were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. Other people say that actually The Gulhani Edict was inspired by Naqshbandi Islamic scholars, and it was couched in a lot of Islamic language and and a lot of Sharia principles. Tell me, what do you think? Do you think this is westernization? Do you think this is westernization in name but not in practice? Or do you think it's a merger of the two? Let me know in the comments section below. The period of the Tanzimat can be looked at from a policy point of view, but it can also be looked at from the point of view of the persona of the Caliph himself. Abdul Majid started to adopt Western clothing, which is not a problem in and of itself. It's not un-Islamic, but he wanted to send a clear sign to Western diplomats who visited him here in Constantinople that he was leading a state in a European Western direction. If you look at the portraits of Abdul Majid and compare it to the portraits of his predecessors, you will see a clear difference. And when these diplomats would come to Constantinople to meet him, they wouldn't be meeting him in the Topkapi Palace. After 400 years, that was removed as the seat of Ottoman power, and a new palace, a very European-looking palace, was built on the shores of the Bosphorus, and that was called the Dolmabahce Palace. In order to catch up technologically and militarily, Abdul Majid would need a lot of funds because such an endeavour is very expensive. The problem is the Ottoman Empire was an empire with a small e, meaning they weren't a colonial empire. They didn't have vast riches to draw upon. So Abdul Majid wanted to increase the taxes from his subject population, but the religious scholars said, no, you can't do that, it's against the religion. So in the end, Abdul Majid had to take interest-based loans from Britain and France, which funnily enough is also against the religion. But he hoped that it would only be a short-term thing and they'd be able to pay the money back quickly, but it didn't turn out that way. A new modern army that would fight for the integrity of the empire was absolutely essential, and for this Abdul Majid would use conscription to gain more soldiers. He would also bring in French and German military officers to give them the latest and best training. Their curriculum included a lot more maths and science and engineering and less Islam. So in other words, they were trained very differently to the Janissaries, who had a very strong ethos of Islam during their training. The religious scholars did not like this. However, there was a certain movement of religious scholars within the empire who thought it was okay. They were called the Naqshbandi scholars. And the reason why they thought it was okay is because they saw the army's job as to fight the enemy in the battlefield and not to get involved in societal affairs and political matters. And this is absolutely true, providing the military don't decide one day that they want to get involved in politics, because that might cause some ideological problems further down the line. Many of the changes instituted by Abdul Majid II seem to me to be very superficial and are very outward, and I think he adopted many of them to appear in a certain way to Western powers, especially Britain and France, because the foreign policy during his time period was to keep Britain and France on his side, because he needed them to keep the Russians in the Black Sea and out of the Bosphorus, otherwise they would have been a threat to his capital. This was recognized by the Tsar in Russia, and in 1853 the Tsar labeled the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, because he knew he was on the verge of conquering them. Britain and France were keen to protect the Ottoman Empire because they knew if the Caliphate was gone, then the balance of power in Europe would completely change and Russia would have great influence in global politics. It might sound strange that I'm saying that Britain and France wanted to protect a caliphate, as I say this in 2022, but this is international politics, and the alliances are always changing for various reasons. So you never know. In the future, they might want to protect one again. Let's wait and see. If you remember from an earlier episode, the Ottomans had lost a battle against the Russians in the 1770s and had to sign a very embarrassing treaty called the Treaty of Küçük-Kayanaka, which gave the Tsar in Russia spiritual leadership of all the Orthodox Christians living within the territories of the Ottoman Empire while they remained subjects of the Ottoman Caliph. In the 1850s, Abdul Majid decided to place the Christians in Jerusalem under the protection of the French. The Russians said this violates the Treaty of Küçük-Kayanaka, so they invaded Ottoman Eastern Europe. Britain and France then came to the aid of the Ottomans, and what ensued was the famous Crimean War, in which Florence Nightingale made her name. But more importantly, it resulted in the Ottomans defeating the Russians for the first time in a very long time. And it also meant that now the Black Sea would become a demilitarized zone, so that now Russians could not sail their ships down and attack the capital Constantinople, so the Ottomans could breathe a sigh of relief. And the Ottomans also got to keep all their holdings in Eastern Europe. In all honesty, the military victory was probably down to the British and the French. It was more of a political and diplomatic victory for the Ottomans. The sick man of Europe was still sick. The only question was, did he have a terminal illness that was going to kill him, or did he have an infection that was curable? In 1861, the Caliph Abdul Majid was literally a sick man. He had tuberculosis, unfortunately, and it got the better of him and he died. So he was replaced as Caliph by his half-brother, who was called Abdul Aziz. Abdul Aziz became the first Caliph to go on a diplomatic mission to Europe. He visited London, Paris and Vienna in an attempt to impress on them that the Ottomans were still a power to be reckoned with and to keep their allegiances that they had. He also took with him a certain Abdul Hamid. More on him in the next episode. Have you ever heard of a nursery rhyme in the Western world, which mothers sing to their children? It goes like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once I caught a fish alive. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then I let it go again. Forgive my singing, but the tune that accompanies the lyrics, which goes was composed by Abdul Aziz, the Caliph of the Ottomans. Not many people know that, but he was very keen on his music. But I find it quite funny that mothers in the Western world use the Caliph's songs to sing to their children, because in this time period many people think that the Ottomans were just copying the West, which is true to some extent. They were taking certain things from them, but also the West was copying the Ottomans. It was two-way traffic, but granted, it was more the Ottomans copying the Western world during the period of the Tanzimat. During the 1800s, the citizens of the Ottoman Empire started to change the way how they identified themselves. A few hundred years earlier, a person living in Belgrade would have identified as an Orthodox Christian, but in the middle of the 1800s, that same person would have identified as much as being Serbian as being Orthodox Christian. This led the Ottomans to question what is our identity. It couldn't be just Islam, because there was lots of non-Muslims within the empire. It couldn't be Turkish, because they weren't fully Turkish, they'd mixed with other ethnicities, and also many of the citizens weren't Turkish either. In the end, they settled for something called Ottomanism. And Ottomanism is a reactionary idea to what was happening in the Balkans. It is not a nationalistic idea, and it's not fully patriotic. There are some elements of patriotism centered around the landmass that was controlled by the House of Osman, and there is an Islamic component to it, but it did not diminish from the non-Muslim citizens in the empire. This was a new idea that was hopefully going to be the soul of the empire that would keep its landmass together. The only question is, would the citizens adopt it, or would outside powers push this new bond to a breaking point? Since the Janissaries, who used to be one of the institutions of power in the Ottoman Empire, had been abolished, power was now more concentrated with the Viziers and with the Caliph. And the Caliph Abdul Aziz was a very lavish spender. He wanted to live like the kings and queens in Europe. The problem is he didn't have the funds of the kings and queens in Europe. One example of his economic mismanagement is this palace, the Beylerbeyi Palace, which was built very soon after the Dolmabahce Palace. There was really no need for it, but he wanted it. And as a result of all his economic policies, the Viziers were very much against him, as the Ottoman Empire was already in debt for the money that they'd borrowed for the Tanzimat period. The public were also against him because of his economic mismanagement. Therefore, this combination of Viziers being against him and public opinion being against him was the perfect circumstances for the Viziers to remove him and replace him with a Caliph that would be happy to work within a constitutional framework, and they hoped this would enable better policy making and enable the empire to move forward. So the Tanzimat period had an impact militarily because a new army was created. It had a political impact because edicts were being issued and a constitutional-like culture was starting to emerge. It had a social impact because a new bond, Ottomanism, was being promoted within the empire. It had an ideological impact because other ideas from other empires were being imported, even though they tried to Islamize them and keep them to a minimum. And it also had an economic impact because the Ottoman Empire was now riddled with debt. However, by 1876 the empire was still alive and kicking. But was this due to all these changes, or was it due to the fact that other empires like the British and the French were keeping it alive and stopping the Russians from taking it over? In the end, in 1876, it was the economic impact which did for Abdul Aziz. He was under pressure from the young Ottoman movement and the Viziers to adopt a constitution, which he rejected. Therefore, he was deposed. 4 days later, he was found in a pool of his own blood in the palace in which he was under house arrest. He was replaced by his nephew called Murad V, but he was found to be mentally unstable. So after a few months, he was deposed and he was replaced by his half-brother. This half-brother, who was now the Caliph, became the only Caliph from the Ottomans to have a whole time period of history named after him. He was the last Caliph to have real political power, and he would be known as the pious Sultan by his subjects and the Red Sultan by his enemies. His rule would be very long and very eventful and absolutely critical in the survival of the Ottoman Empire. And if you want to know more about him, make sure you press subscribe, hit the bell button, and watch my next episode in the history of the Ottomans, from Ertugrul to Ataturk. Salam.